Welcome to Gemara Academy. In this class, we will learn Tosfos Dibur Maschel V'chi Oimrim Leila Adam Chatei B'Shvil Sheyiska Chavercha. Let's begin by looking at the flowchart of the Gemara so we can see what part of the Gemara Tosfos is coming to explain. See, here we have the question of Rav Sheshes. Rav Sheshes asked on the answer that was presented by Rav Shili. Rav Shili said that the question of Rav Bibi Bar Abaye was in a case where an individual placed a piece of dough in the oven on Shabbos in a state of shegig, and he remained in that state of shegig, and let's say he walked off somewhere and somebody else observed this. And the question is, did they permit this other individual to remove the bread from the oven before his fellow comes to a chiyav chatas or not? The issue is that removing bread from the oven is the issa d'Rabbanan. So Rav Shila explained that was the question of Rav Bibi Bar Abaye. Did they permit this individual to do an issa d'Rabbanan to benefit his fellow, not to do greater isser, the isser chiyuv chatas min hatera, or did they not permit him to do an avera midrabbanan, even though his fellow will come to an isser min hatera of a chiyuv chatas? To that, Rav Sheshes asked, do we ever tell one person to do an avera so that his fellow benefits? Rabbi Bibi Bar Abaye would never have asked this question, because we never tell one person to do a small avera in order to benefit his fellow. So let's begin with a general outline of Tosfos. We have the opinion of Rav Sheshes that we don't tell a person to do a small avera in order to benefit his fellow from avoiding a bigger avera. So in Tosfos, what we're going to do over here is we're going to challenge this principle. We're not going to compare other cases like we'll see in Tosfos, and this is very important to keep in mind. The purpose of Tosfos is not to compare other cases to our case, but rather to question this principle, because Rav Sheshes presented it as a general principle. Do we ever tell a person do an avera in order that his fellow benefit? We're going to challenge that principle. Let's see it in Tosfos now in the flowchart. So we presented the opinion of Rav Sheshes that we don't tell one person to do a small avera in order to save another from an avera, a larger avera, a bigger avera. It says Tosfos, he bavorns a question. He didn't actually ask a question, but he points out. And this that Rebbe said that it's good, Talmud Chacham rather do a small avera than allow the Amoritz to do a big avera. The case over there is that somebody overheard a Talmud Chacham tell an Amoritz that he could take some of the figs from the Talmud Chacham's tree. The Talmud Chacham gave permission to the Amoritz to take some of his figs from the tree. And the din is that a person needs to take meiser before eating food, and otherwise it's tevel, and there's a chiyuv misa involved. And one of the din is that a person cannot take meiser until the produce is already picked from the tree. So now it's certain that the Talmud Chacham didn't take produce from these figs because they weren't picked from the tree yet. In addition, there's another din, which is when a person takes meiser from a pile of fruit, he should take it from that pile itself. It's called min hamukaf. Take a part of that pile for meiser, and not take from a different pile, having in mind this pile. The din is that if somebody overheard a Talmud Chacham telling Amoritz, take some of the figs from the tree, we say that the Talmud Chacham for sure took meiser. He wouldn't tell somebody to take figs, certain Amoritz doesn't plan on taking meiser. He wouldn't tell him to take figs that meiser weren't taken from. Sorry, the Talmud Chacham took meiser, and we say he probably did it shalei min hamukaf. So Rebbe explains, because noyach le'lechaver, it's preferable for the Talmud Chacham le'eved isur klila, that he should do a small avera of taking meiser shalei min hamukaf, v'le'la Amoritz isur rabba. The Amoritz shouldn't do a greater isur of eating tevel. So how does that fit with this principle? We see an individual. We see the Talmud Chacham is doing a small avera to protect his fellow from a large avera. Explains Tosfos. That's because over there it's not pshat that the Talmud Chacham is doing a small avera for the benefit of the Amoritz avoiding a big avera, but rather the Talmud Chacham is doing a small avera in order to avoid him being the cause of the Amoritz doing a big avera. Because over there he told the Amoritz, take from my figs, and therefore he's the cause to it. So this general principle can still apply and be consistent, even though we have this din, because the principle is saying that we don't tell an individual to do an avera to benefit a different individual. But in this instance, it's not totally removed from him the greater avera, rather it's connected to him because he told Amoritz, he instructed him to take from his figs. Now Tosfos is going to go to a side point, the teaching from Re, but again, pay attention that it's a side point. To remember the context, that here we're discussing this principle. Tosfos points out that we can't say from here, now we can resolve the question of Bibi Bar Abaye in an instance where a person put it in by mistake and then realized his mistake. Or a person put it in on purpose and now wants to remove it. In those two cases, we have an individual put it in by mistake or on purpose, and now he wants to remove it. We could see from this case of the Talmud of the Chaver and the Amaritz, that a person could do a small avera for himself in order to avoid a larger avera that he caused. So too here, he's allowed to remove the bread from the oven in order to avoid the greater avera of an Isser of baking bread. Says Reed that no, we can't make that conclusion. And the reason is because in the case of the Amaritz, the Talmud Chacham, the Amaritz, there are two averas that one of them is going to happen here. Either a small avera will be done, an avera be a dayim, he will take Meiser Shleim and a Mukaf, or a big avera will be done. The Amaritz will eat Tevel. So then we might say do the small avera to avoid the larger avera from being done. However, in our case, the question is not is a small avera going to be done or a big avera going to be done. The big avera was already done. The part of it that's biyadayim. The bread didn't bake yet, but the action of putting bread in the oven, that was already done. So in such an instance, where the question is should we do a small avera and not avoid a big avera, but avoid the end result of the large avera, the baking of the bread, possibly we'll say no. Don't do the small avera, even though there'll be a bigger avera because the bigger avera's action was already done. And to do a small avera just to avoid the result of the bigger avera, that we don't necessarily say. So just to summarize that for a moment, we'll say do a small avera to avoid doing a big avera. But we won't say do a small avera in order to avoid the completion of the big avera that was already started, already began, was already done. The action part of it. Now Tosfos continues and further challenges this general teaching that Rav Sheshes presented as a general principle that we don't tell a person to do a small avera for his fellow. It says that we've kaifen is rabbi, a person's chetzei eved, the chetzei ben cherin, is half slave and half free, and so he can't marry a free woman because he's half slave. He can't marry a slave woman because he's half free. So kaifen is rabbi, we force his master and he has to make him free. And this is even though it teaches over there that for a person to free a slave is against the mitzvahs I say of la'olam b'em taveda. You have to always work your slaves and never allowed to free, never kanani. What do we see over here? That we're telling the master he should do an avera. He should be over the mitzvah of la'olam b'em tavedu. For what purpose? So that his slave could be mekayim the mitzvah of puravu. So we see that we do tell a person to do a small avera for the benefit of his fellow. Explains Tosfos that the principle, this is an exception to the principle, and the reason is because it's a mitzvah rabbah. In other words, the general rule is we don't tell a person to do a small avera for the benefit of his fellow, but this is a disproportionately great benefit, out of the ordinary. Then this principle doesn't apply. And Tosfos brings the support to this. Over there it says in the Gemara, a story of Rabbi Lezer, that he came to a shul, there was only 9 people, so he freed his Eved Kanani, which through becoming free, he becomes considered he's a regular Yid, he's a full-fledged Yid, so that they can have a minyan. And the Gemara explains over there, how was he permitted to do this? If there's a mitzvah saseh, the lo'ilam b'em tavedu, you have to work your slaves forever, you can never free them. The Gemara explains, because mitzvah de rabbim shiny, it's a mitzvah of rabbim, so we see that there are certain mitzvahs that they are considered out of the ordinary, they're exceptions. And therefore, although we have this general rule not to do an avera in order to benefit, in order for a person's fellow to benefit, that's generally speaking. But here we have a benefit that's disproportionately greater than the usual. Then we make an exception. Another answer that Tosfos gives is that this general rule of ein aidim miladim chatei b'shul she'iske chavercha, we don't tell a person to do a small avera so that his fellow benefit, is all under a specific umbrella, the specific condition. When his fellow was pesheh, he was negligent. Like in our case, he put bread in the oven on Shabbos. He was being negligent. However, when there's no negligence involved, then we don't say this rule. We most certainly tell a person, we tell a person, do a small avera so that your fellow can benefit. Like we tell the master, free your slave, do that avera of being over, so that he can benefit and do the mitzvah of puravu, because he wasn't negligent. The fact that he became half free and half slave had nothing to do with him. It's because he had 2 masters, one freed him and one didn't. Therefore, since there's no negligence, we most certainly do tell a person to do a small avera to benefit your fellow in a greater way. Tosfos says, according to this answer, it resolves 2 other questions, which are elaborated at length in Tosfos, and we'll explain briefly. There's a din that we learn from the pasuk Allah Hashlim Kala Karbonos Kulam, that the last carbon of the day is the carbon tamid. There's another din that if a person, certain types of tumah, if a person has that tumah, at the end of the tumah, when it's finished, he has to first bring a carbon before he's allowed to partake from kachim. So the din is that if an individual needed to bring this carbon, but they already brought the carbon tamid, which has to be the last carbon, but it's also Erev Pesach, and if he now doesn't bring it, if he didn't bring his carbon, he's not allowed to eat from kachim until he brings his carbon after the tumah. He's not allowed to partake of kachim. The din is we tell the kahanim they should be over the mitzvah say of Allah Hashem Kala Karbonos Kulam. They should be over the mitzvah say that the tamid should be the last carbon. They should bring this person's carbon after the carbon tamid, in order that he could bring this carbon Pesach, which has in it a chiyuv karos. Now we can understand the reason, because he wasn't negligent. Like Mefarshim explained why it wasn't a case of negligence. So we see, this rule, don't tell us to a person to do a small avera to benefit his friend from a larger avera or mitzvah, only applies when there's an issue of negligence at hand. Here there was no negligence, so we most certainly will tell him do a small one for the benefit of his fellow. Another example is if a kohen's working in the Beis Hamikdash and discovers that he has a abelis, a growth, and the din is a person can't do avoid in such a situation, and it's on Shabbos, and he can't remove the abelis himself. It's on a part of his body that he can't reach. We tell a different kohen to remove it with his teeth, so that it should be done with his shinui, so that his fellow kohen can do the avodah. So we tell one kohen to do an avera, so that his fellow can benefit in a greater way. And the reason, once again, is because here there was no negligence, so we do ask one person to help another. Now Tosfos points out a question according to both of these answers, and he more addresses it with that, not in a question form, but again in the arrow, regarding the case of Chetzia Shifcha v'Chetzia Bascherin, a woman who's half slave and half free. As a result, can't get married to anybody. And Nagu Amban Minag Hefker, and people were doing averis with her, averis znus. So why the din is that we force the master to free her. So we find the master being obligated to be over mitzvah say for the benefit of others, that they shouldn't do an aver of znus. Tosfos explains according to both answers. According to the answer of Shia, she was machzeres umamtzia atzma. She was being promiscuous. Therefore, they're considered einsim and not peishim. So, therefore, one person should do an avera to help his fellow. He should be over aleilam tavedu to help his fellow from the avera of znus. And according to the answer of mitzvah rabbah, this is a mitzvah of rabbim, because the rabbim would be nichshol, and therefore the master should free her and do that avera, that they should be removed from the avera of znus. So, to summarize Tosfos, we introduced this principle from Rav Sheshes. In other words, we do not tell a person to do a small avera for the benefit of his fellow to avoid a great avera. And Tosfos explains that although this is said as a general principle, there are exceptions, and the principle can still remain intact. The exceptions are: number one, if the person himself is connected to the big avera, then we will tell him do a small avera to avoid being part of the bigger avera. It's not for his fellow; it's also for himself. Another exception is if the mitzvah is disproportionately greater; it's out of the ordinary, like mitzvah derabim or the mitzvah of puravu. Another explanation is that this entire principle of that we don't tell a person to do a small avera for the benefit of his fellow is said specifically and exclusively in an instance where his fellow was a peisheya, he was negligent. Then don't do a small avera for his benefit. But if his fellow wasn't negligent, then oimrim v'oimrim, we most certainly do tell him do a small avera to benefit your fellow.